have a program, and I'm delighted to talk about what we're doing at the European Medicines Agency and what we've done over the past couple of years.
Excellent. So let's start at the beginning of a tenure. You took office in late 2020, about 1 year into the pandemic, before a vaccine was approved, and your predecessor, Guido Rasi, described it at the time as the middle of the biggest public health emergency in a century. So looking back, what have been the biggest lessons for the EMA to learn on how to operate during a pandemic?
Well, thank you very much for bringing me back to those early days. I took over in November 2020, so 8 months into the pandemic, but at a very, very exciting time for vaccine development. And as Guido says, this was a game changer in trying to operate in times of real crisis, where demand for new medicines and vaccines was really key to addressing the public health challenges. So before I go into some of the lessons learned, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the successes, because now we're 2.5 years on. I feel sometimes we lose sight of what really has happened over these years. So in Europe, we have many figures we can be proud of. We have 6 new authorized vaccines. We've 8 treatments for COVID-19. We've over 1.2 billion doses provided to European citizens, and over 2.2 billion doses exported to over 160 countries in the world. The European vaccine strategy was a game changer. So this was the strategy that allowed us to provide vaccines to all the European countries. This had not been done before. But it was a time of really intense scientific collaboration among regulators, collaboration among scientists, collaboration among governments, all trying to find some solution for this terrible public health crisis. So to be honest, we were learning every single day. We were trying to do things differently. We were having to adapt to what has been the biggest public health crisis in the time of the EMA. And we were working at intense speed in a time of really sophisticated scientific developments. So I would say, if I had to talk about 3 things that we have learned during this time, I would first of all talk about the power of science. To be able to deliver new vaccines and therapeutics within this short time frame really reflects the power of science, and we should respect this. I think the power of international collaboration, particularly from the regulatory side, was unprecedented. I'm head of a medicines regulator, and I chair a group of medicines regulators, of heads of medicines regulators from across the globe. And we did everything we could to prepare for the eventuality that there would be new vaccines and new products that we would need to examine quickly, but really to robust and high standards. So we were meeting weekly. We were looking at anticipating pharmacovigilance issues. We were trying to see how the development process, how we could look at some of the trials in sequence. We at the European Medicines Agency were doing rolling reviews. So instead of waiting for the full package of data, we were looking at discrete packages of data so that we could evaluate those and then help us to accelerate the time frame for the final package. So we were effectively working around the clock at a time of intense need for agility and basic hard work. I think it exposed a number of issues. It exposed the successes of the system, but also some of the weaknesses. And one of the challenges I would say that we found was the ability to have sustainable resources to deal with what was an ongoing, relentless demand for evaluation. And in a very small area. So it was in the infectious disease area, and it's very hard to suddenly recruit a whole lot of new infectious disease specialists. So we were, the work fell to a relatively small group of people. So one of the lessons that we have learned is how we can we look at preparing for future emergencies? Can we onboard people quicker? Can we reprioritize quicker? Can we look at really how we adapt to a changing situation in a very agile way? And the third issue I'd like to raise is the power of communication, because we pride ourselves on being strong communicators and a transparent organization. But the demand for information, the need for transparency and communication, the need for rapid answers increased incredibly. So if you think about our normal press and media team, the demand went up something like 600% in the first quarter of 2021. So again, we were trying to recruit people from all over the agency to deal with the needs of the public. We were organizing public stakeholder meetings. We hadn't done that before. We were increasing our media footprint. And of course, the other thing that we had not anticipated was the amount of misinformation and fake information that we would have to deal with, in addition to explaining the science.
Great. We'll get to some of those points you raised later, but for now, I'd like to turn to the most recent developments. You've recently approved 2 different types of bivalent shots, and that's a different approach from the US Food and Drug Administration, which has focused clearly on the so-called BA.4/5 bivalent approach. And that's arguably a better choice for EU members and their autumn vaccine campaigns, but isn't there a risk of confusing the general public with these complex options that they now have?
So the approach that we've taken in Europe is to have a plurality of options, because we recognize that the needs in different member states may be different. The timing of their vaccination campaigns are not all the same. Some people are combining with influenza. Some people are waiting until a little bit later. We have different climate contexts. We have different healthcare contexts. So all this points to the need to have a plurality of options that member states can choose from. We thought that looking at or being able to quickly review both the bivalent BA.1 vaccines, which had been anticipated. We had got together through ICMRA to look at what we thought would make sense for the autumn-winter season. But of course, the variant is changing all the time, okay. And we are having to make the best decisions in a constantly changing environment.
Okay.
I think we will learn a lot from this, the vaccination campaign this autumn and winter. We learn which vaccines are better in matching the circulating variants, and we don't know what those circulating variants will be. So having a plurality of options makes sense for us.
But for an individual who's now has the choice, I would say in a number of countries, both vaccines would now be available. What would your advice be for them? as an individual who's not a trained expert, would then have to decide which vaccine will I seek?
So I find it interesting that people are now seeking vaccines. This is a long way from where we have been historically. I mean, can you remember choosing which vaccine you used to vaccinate your children? I think, from the European Medicines Agency perspective, any vaccine that we approve is based on the best scientific knowledge. We make sure that it meets robust quality, safety, and efficacy standards, and we want the public to have confidence in this. Now, we know that there are choices. People can make choices, but really a lot depends on what's available in your jurisdiction, what your national immunization committee or your healthcare professionals are advising. I think really the difference between any of the adapted vaccines is unlikely to be very, very large. So I think my message is have confidence in whatever vaccines are offered to you. It isn't just because it sounds like it's the most recent that it's going to necessarily be the best.
Okay. So the EMA earlier this year made a point of requiring testing on humans of the new Omicron adapted vaccines. And one notable example now with the two vaccines that we have is that one, the BA1, has indeed been tested on humans, and the other one where the trials have not been completed. So how has the reasoning changed that you're now clearing a product that has not indeed been fully tested on humans?
So I think it's important to emphasize how much data we have on the existing vaccines. Even at the time of first authorization, we had the number of patients or the number of subjects in clinical trials was more than we would ever have for a new vaccine. And we have continued to learn about these vaccines, both through clinical trials and through real-world evidence from the amazing amount of uptake that we've seen across the world. So it's not uncommon for us to extrapolate data from one type of vaccine to another, based on the totality of data that we have. So we were confident that the differences between the variants was small, and that we would be able to use the data that we had, not just on the new adapted vaccines, but also on the existing vaccines, also some of the iterations that never made it to market, where we had additional information from the clinical field, and all this allowed us to have confidence in giving a positive scientific opinion on the BA4, BA5. So there is a huge amount of data. The trials in humans continue, and that will come in, I believe, November. We're expecting the first data, maybe a little bit earlier. But the overall data that's available that supports the efficacy of these vaccines it gives us the confidence to be positive.
Okay. I want to return to the public's willingness overall to seek boosters and shots. Arguably, many people have grown tired of the pandemic, and they've had experience of their own with infections, and social distancing measures have been lifted. So what message do you need to send to the public now to boost the participation and the uptake?
Yeah, so I think we're victims of our own success. We have had effective vaccines that have really had an impact on hospitalization and death. But the pandemic is not over, and we don't know what's around the corner. So the advice is we would say two things. One, if you have not been vaccinated, please get your primary series of vaccination. That is the best thing you can do for your own health to protect you. And if you have been vaccinated already, knowing that we expect a difficult winter. We don't know what that means. But again, the best thing you can do at this point in time is to take the booster that's offered to you.
I'm looking maybe a few years ahead. What's your estimate of the most likely booster pattern that we will need to adopt going forward? Is it every autumn, or is it just opportunistically when a new variant of concern emerges?
You know, we're learning all the time. I think most of your listeners will be used to the seasonality of the influenza vaccine, but the pattern of variants with the COVID have not so far really shown the seasonality, though we have seen higher peaks in the winter months as people go indoors, as restrictions are lifted. I think we learn a lot from this winter. And if we'll see how if we can keep the uptake of the booster vaccines. We can keep improving the uptake of the booster vaccines. That will help us see how we would need to prepare for new variants in the future.
Okay. The research community is, of course, thinking ahead about new generations of vaccines, and there's certainly an unmet need to prevent infection rather than just disease, and also have a broader protection against all sorts of variants. So what kind of scientific advances do you anticipate, and when do you think they will materialize?
So there's a huge amount of research going on at the moment on broadly protective vaccines, various stages of development, but looking at, again, rather than or in addition to preventing hospitalization and death, trying to see if they can be more broadly protective and also have more of an impact against transmission. We're talking to companies all the time, companies and research organizations all the time. So far, we haven't seen anything that's ready for the market. But once the trials are completed, we'll be in a position to decide whether or not the options that are being looked at the moment could reach the market. What's
your view on the probability of success of nasal sprays? I mean, they've been discussed as a way to immunize the airways directly. What do you think? When is that going to happen?
Well, we're seeing quite a lot of development in the intermucosal area. You probably are aware that 2 nasal vaccines are starting to be used now in China and India respectively, and I believe there's also one in Iran and maybe also in Russia. We're in talks, or companies have come to us with their development plans for these vaccines. So far, the data we've seen is still preliminary, so we're not in a position to give timing on that. But I think the fact that there is so much development going on in this area is very positive. And hopefully we'll be able to see some important results in the near future.
Okay. I'd like to address what you mentioned earlier, the problem of disinformation and the spread of falsehood over the internet, over digital media. And it's particularly a rise in anti-vaccine arguments. That's a question from the audience also. And how do you think the EMA has to react to that and maybe change its communication strategy?
So very good question. And again, an area where we are definitely learning and investing. We do a lot of what we call social listening to try and anticipate or try and understand what the key themes in social media are so that we can adapt our communication accordingly. We work with a number of different sources where they collect or they review all the media platforms to try and understand what we might need to address that could cause harm. I mean, our priority is to provide robust scientific information, but we need to provide it in a way that is understandable to the public. And it is challenging for us to address what is clearly fake information. And I think the way we have been doing this is by assuring the public that the information we are providing is scientifically based and supported and is as transparent as possible. But I do think we need to do more research in some of the social aspects of communication. And it's an area where even if we have some great communication colleagues in-house and within Europe, the dynamics are changing all the time. And we're trying to translate scientific decisions into messages that will be understood and will combat fake or misinformation. And that requires, it's not a skill that many scientists have. So it is an area where I think we need to invest more and keep challenging ourselves to address this issue.
Thanks. So with looking forward, looking ahead, we'll probably, or hopefully, we'll see fewer infections overall. And when there are new vaccine candidates that are being proposed that will be reviewed by you, we clearly cannot do the kind of mass trials that we saw 2 years ago, where people just get randomly infected during their normal lives. So give us a sense of what kind of trial design is viable so that new vaccine technologies can still produce valid data and produce it fast?
Well, very good question. I think, yes, we've been extremely, in terms of the data that has supported the currently authorized vaccines, that has been unprecedented in quantity. And yes, we can't expect to have the same amount of data on the new vaccines, simply because the same number of infections aren't happening, and it's harder to have the naive populations that we had before. So this is something that our clinical trial specialists are looking at. I would say two things, looking at what the best way to do trials on new vaccines, but also looking at platforms for trials in emergency situations that you have, that you can use more or less off the shelf and adapt them to the situation of a new emergency or pandemic, because the speed at which these a trial start is one of the rate limiting steps in moving us forward in these situations.
Okay. There's of course a bigger need to monitor the benefits and risks of any shots approved after approval, and the focus turns to real world evidence generated by the public health systems. Are you happy with the public health data that member states provide that you need to validate your decisions?
So this is an area where I think we need to work more, particularly to ensure that we can combine the data sources from public health authorities and from other investigations. We have worked very closely with the European Centre for Disease Control, and we get feedback on the use of the vaccines from the public health systems. But we also have initiated a vaccine monitoring platform together with ECDC, where we can target specific studies and make sure that we get answers to specific questions that then help us to understand how the vaccines perform in real life. So two areas we're working on there. We have this vaccine monitoring platform that we already started to do some work through during the current pandemic. But we also have set up a new center for collecting real-world data. It's called the Darwin EU Data Analytics and Real-World Interrogation Network, and this is it's in the early stages, but we've already established a coordinating center, and we have recruited a number of data sources from Europe and beyond to provide federated data to help answer some of the questions and use cases. Now, of course, this isn't just for vaccines, this is for all medicines, but I think the efforts that we're making on real world evidence and trying to have a common data model, because one of the challenges in bringing together the data is that people collect it differently, and if we use a common data model, we can federate the data much more easily. So that's the concept behind Darwin, and we really see it will be a very valuable tool going forward.
Well, you probably agree that there have been huge discrepancies in the amount of data that European countries provide when it comes to this kind of real-world evidence that's scientifically usable. And the UK has provided a huge amount, and Germany, for instance, certainly hasn't been a shining example. So what can be done to encourage countries to generate, this really important data going forward?
So I think agreement on the data we need and agreement on the data models is key to generating data that will be useful. Again, the German regulator is co-chair of our Darwin advisory group, and I know they're investing a huge amount in digitalization and use of data. But it takes a bit of time. So I think we need, what I always like to say is, let's have a few successes, and then this also helps us to galvanize the activity and to ensure that we really do deliver the best data for the European people.
Okay. So a broader topic, with Brexit came the independence of the UK drugs regulator, MHRA, and it joined an international group called Access Consortium. And that has established a new player in the global regulatory landscape. And it's become very clear that the UK regulator is trying to be very fast in its decisions. So does that create a dynamic that the EMA also needs to react to?
Well, let me just say that we work very closely with regulators throughout the world, including with the UK MHRA and all the regulators who make up Access. And I have to say, I think Access is it's a wonderful facility, a work sharing facility for medium-sized regulators, where the benefits to the individual regulators. It means that they can rely on the work that's done by others. We have a similar system, of course, in Europe already. We already have a work sharing concept, and we use work sharing concepts in many of our international collaborations. But of course, we're always looking at how we can do things better. And I think one of the triumphs of the last couple of years is it's given us the opportunity to do things differently, to see how we can improve, to see how we can be more efficient, to look at international best practices, and then to try and adapt the European system accordingly. And let me just mention that it's a very exciting time for the European pharmaceutical environment as well, because we have the review of the pharmaceutical legislation coming up, and we expected the first version from the Commission to be available end of this year or the beginning of next year. And if we hadn't had the pandemic and learned all the lessons on some of the things that we have actually managed to change without legislation, I think we'd be in a much worse place now. So we see lots of opportunities, and we're looking at the review of the legislation to put what needs to be in legislation in practice.
There's also a development in the United States where the US Food and Drug Administration has clearly shown a trend of authorizing more drugs faster. And I guess the approval of the Biogen Alzheimer's drugs has been a particularly contentious example. But what does that mean for how the EMA operates? Are there conclusions to be drawn?
So, I think it's important that as a European system, we evaluate the data independently and according to our standards of safety, efficacy, and quality. And of course, the standards in general are internationally validated, but sometimes the context of a particular medication might be different depending on what else is on the market elsewhere, depending on the availability and utility of certain tests. So if you need a test that isn't available in Europe to use as a particular product effectively, this might be something that might mean that we take a different approach in Europe. So it's never as easy as saying it's never as easy as saying we have to do exactly the same as another regulator. It really depends a lot, yes. But for some interventions, the dependence on the healthcare systems and the availability of different interfaces may be very important.
Okay. Well, there are certainly changes at the EMA with its extended mandate. It's a wider remit that acknowledges its importance during the crisis, and part of that role, a wider role, is to monitor supply shortages in critical medicines. That's something that's happening quite frequently across Europe. And what can the EMA bring to the table here to address that issue?
So yes, so we have an extended mandate which was voted in by Council and Parliament, and we have started to implement it from the 1st of March of this year. A lot of the extension of our mandate builds on work that we did on a voluntary cooperation basis during the pandemic. So, for example, we didn't have a formal legal role in managing shortages. But in the first months of intense infections, increase in intensive care patients, the impact of lockdowns, export bans. We were seeing shortages, and just the increase of patients, we were seeing shortages across Europe, and also a need to coordinate it. So we actually set up a steering group to look at this. We set up single points of contacts in each of the member states. We identified single points of contact in the companies to help us manage. We worked closely with the wholesalers, with the distributors, trying to get intelligence as to where the likely problems were and where the availability was, because one of the challenges was that there may have been a shortage in a particular country that was seeing a high demand at a particular point in time, but it didn't mean that the product wasn't available somewhere else. So having more information on exactly where the products were really helped us to manage the critical intensive care products at the time. So now with our new mandate, we have a formal role to identify what are critical medicines during a public health emergency, or what they call a major event, so where there's a high risk of shortages. We identify what these critical medicines are, and then we have requirements to monitor the demand and supply, and to try and put in measures to mitigate shortages. So this is something that we are now doing formally within our mandate since the 1st of March.
Now, if you look at the energy prices, it's, I guess, easy to imagine that it will also affect generic drug makers and active ingredients makers. And sometimes they are faced with fixed prices, administered prices by public health systems. So is that going to make shortages even worse? And what can be done here?
So just to say that we have been, we're continuing to monitor shortages, and particularly at the start of the war with Ukraine, we were very concerned that it would have a major impact on supply, particularly at the time because of the increased number of refugees and the demand for medicines. This seems to have been well managed, but of course we can't anticipate, or we don't know the extent to which the energy crisis will cause problems as we move forward. But it is something that we're in close contact with the marketing authorization holders, the generic companies, the research-based companies, and they have an obligation to inform us of any anticipated supply chain disruptions or shortages, and that then helps us to manage it in real life.
Okay, so so it's, I don't know what my question is, I guess, what role does this whole margin issue play, where you maybe have to acknowledge that some generics makers need better pay to stay in the market, or is that rather one of many issues?
Well, certainly this is a concern. It's not something that we as the European Medicines Agency have a mandate to do anything about, but it is an area where we work closely with HERA in the European Commission, also with DG Sante, and we try to anticipate and any problems we get or any anticipated shortages from the point of view of the suppliers. And then with respect to how to manage them from a European policy perspective, that comes that's outside our remit, but and from the member states, it's member states who are responsible for pricing and reimbursement. And this is something that all we can do here is raise awareness of what the issues are and make sure that there's close coordination.
Right. Another disease outbreak we need to discuss, monkeypox, of course. recent infection trends in Europe have been rather reassuring, but still there's a recent development whereby the emergency task force issued advice on how to change the route of administration, different kind of injection practice that allows to stretch out the existing stocks to far more people. That still, I guess, was a break with the previous medical practice. Is that currently still advised or justified, do you think?
So yes, so first of all, I think it is the messages that we're getting is that the case numbers are plateauing in Europe, and that's positive, but it's by no means it is difficult to anticipate whether they will actually go down or not. So and we do know that there is a shortage in the supply of vaccines. Just to highlight that the HERA has provided some donations of vaccines and also some joint procurement of vaccines, but the company who's manufacturing the vaccine is a relatively small company. The lead time for new production is quite long. So it's not that we can expect a huge increase in supplies in the very near future. So where there is still high demand, we know that some countries are using the intradermal route to optimize the supply.
And overall, what is your assessment of the infection situation in monkeypox? The WHO has indicated they see the end in sight of that as a global problem. What's your view?
Well, I very much hope that the WHO the predictions are correct. I'm heartened by the fact that we see that the case numbers are plateauing in Europe. I think the communication campaigns and the focus on risk groups has been very effective. But I think it's probably too early to claim success yet. I think we need to keep monitoring very closely and make sure that we remain vigilant in case of any increase in cases or unexpected surges.
Thanks. And taking some more questions from the audience here. During the pandemic, we've clearly seen the EMA take a more adaptive, accelerated review process. We've seen examples where you have provided advice to member states on certain therapeutics even before they received regulatory approval. All sorts of tools that speed up the development, and what of that can be regularly carried forward into a non-pandemic situation where you say, this is a lesson we've learned. This would also work in a non-urgent kind of emergency situation.
Yeah, so one of the tools that we've used to provide scientific opinions when there was less evidence than we would normally require has been the so-called Article 5.3 opinion, and this allows us to give a scientific opinion based on the data, based on a question that's put to the committee, and we've used this quite effectively to support some member state campaigns on unauthorized medicines, and most of them have gone on to be authorized once the full data was available. As part of our extended mandate, we have a new tool that so the tool that we were using wasn't exclusively for emergencies, so it could be used in other situations. I think you would really only want to use it when there was a very high unmet medical need. It is not something that you do lightly. The revision of the legislation now with our new mandate gives us again a role to provide a rapid scientific opinion in an emergency situation, but we still maintain the possibility to answer any scientific question. But really, when I look back at when we've used it, we used it in Ebola before. We've used some support for compassionate use programs to help availability of promising unauthorized medicines. But there has to be a real public health need before we would use such an approach routinely.
Right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So, Ms. Cooke, thank you very much for speaking to us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.